Excuse me. Is it better?
Yes, thanks a lot. I will try to outline some thoughts on the example of Buddhism in Asian countries in regards to how does religion shape stem cell research. And I will begin with my abstract because I'm not sure if I will be able to show all slides. Well, although the central position of non-harming of any sentient beings in combination with the traditional view that human life begins at conception could force Buddhists to take a rather restrict stance on embryonic stem cell research, Buddhists in South, Southeast and East Asian countries are divided in regard to stem cell research issues. This does not only pertain to different interpretations of the respective ethical principles or values, for example, how to cope with suffering and karma, or the absence of a strong concept of human dignity, and traditional accounts on when and how human life begins. Of central impact are, furthermore, conflicting views on ethics themselves, namely, if Buddhist ethics are conceptualized as flexible training rules only, or if the normative rules for monastic conduct, the Vinaya, where a rather strict view is espoused, shall be followed by all Buddhists, including lay Buddhists. Finally, there are divergent views on how Buddhists shall bring their ethical framework into the regional or national legal procedures of stem cell research regulations. This is, of course, also structured by different incorporation regimes of the respective countries, such as Thailand, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, China, Korea, and Japan. Therefore, I will argue that due to the characteristics of Buddhist ethics and discourse, and due to different national regimes, there is no direct causal relation between Buddhist views and recent stem cell research regulations of these countries. However, the more it comes to individual decision making, let's say regional ethic committees or decision making at the bedside, Buddhist views and religious views in general are a crucial factor. Now, in regard to the overall topic, it would be necessary to discuss what is the position between religion and society and science. It would be necessary for our test case, the Buddhist ethical evaluation, to say something on Buddhist ethics, and then on two examples in Thailand and Korea, and let's see how far this may get. Of course, the difficulty is that all these dimensions are interconnected. The impact of religion, the globalization of biomedicine and human embryonic stem cell research, and the globalization of bioethics. So what I could see in my empirical research in Sri Lanka and in Thailand is that biomedicine and bioethics were introduced in one and the same move, and forced the religious traditions, namely Buddhism in that case, to react not only to a certain epistemology of science, biomedicine, but also to certain ethical ideas of the West, namely the difference of consequentialist ethics and deontology. The dimensions of possible influence is not only ethics, but also morals, morality, and cultural practices, certain soteriological ideas, dogmas, and myths, and also the traditional accounts of the beginning and the end of life. If you have a religious tradition with a large corpus of authoritative texts, then for sure there will be some statements in regard to abortion. And the question has been crucial if these statements in regard to abortion shall be applied to more modern technologies. Of course, due to the scientific point of view which introduced the idea of sperm and egg, which was only possible with the invention of, for example, the microscope, the pre-modern concepts do not argue that there is a sperm or egg, but there are other concepts of fertile substances, for example. And the discussion in Buddhist traditions has been, shall we transfer these pre-modern concepts to modern scientific behaviors and or not? So it's not only about ethics, but about a whole epistemic culture. Epistemic cultures are, according to Knorr Cetina, those amalgams of arrangements and mechanisms bonded through affinity, necessity, and historical coincidence, which in a given field make up how we know what we know. Epistemic cultures are cultures that create and warrant knowledge, and the premier knowledge institution throughout the world is still science. So for Buddhists, the question has been, shall our own philosophical religious tradition be compatible to science with all its practices or not? And only very rarely the question of human embryonic stem cells are in focus. It's much more a general point of view. So, is there a Buddhist influence in these countries? To say it straightforward, I think there is only a marginal influence, because in all these countries, in the regulations, there is not a trace of some kind of Buddhist ideas. Most of these regulations on the state level are formulated in terms of Western philosophy. And second, in the committees themselves, only very occasionally are representatives of religious traditions, which is an interesting fact that I could encounter in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and also in India. Furthermore, it is very complicated to argue for a religious influence, because the institutional setting of the regulatory bodies in these countries is rather complicated. And so, to give the example of Thailand, there's a Medical Council of Thailand, then there is a cooperative committee of the National Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology and the Thai National Health Foundation, and then there is the Ministry of Science, Technology and Environment. And even though they enacted a regulation, it is fully unclear for whom it is, for the medical professionals, for research, and still one may see that the framework in these countries is rather complicated. There are national bioethic committees and advisory boards. Then there are different ministries with different political agendas. For example, the Ministry of Health representing the health professionals, or the Ministry of Science representing more interests of the pharmaceutical companies, etc. And then there are NGOs such as the UNESCO, or religious NGOs which represent religious traditions, but this is only a very minor factor within the regulating bodies. This could also be seen and could be shown in the regulation of the UNESCO themselves. I will skip that. There was a hearing of the International Bioethics Committee, and Pinit Ratanakun, one of the leading Thai Buddhist bioethicists, was invited to portray Buddhist principles there. And he said, for example, the principle of beneficence is a useful action guide. However, it may be replaced by the principle of compassion, which would be a Buddhist principle, which is more comprehensive, for it includes both beneficence and non-maleficence. From the Buddhist perspective, compassion involves both doing all we can to benefit others, to enhance the value of their lives, and to do no harm to them, etc. And then he argues, Asian cultures may be called a we-self culture oriented to the interrelated dimension of the individual. Any attempt to globalize the I-self culture of bioethics is against the spirit of tolerance. There you can see also the Asian values debate and all this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, in the final declaration, not a word of all the religious leaders had been heard, and it is formulated in a way that shows even for this NGO, the religious traditions seem to create more problems because they have their particularist point of view. In regards to Buddhist ethics, it is still more complicated, because there is no Buddhist ethics. In a way, it is an offender or perpetrator-centered perspective. So it's not talking about possible victims, for example embryos, but it's only talking about the intention of those involved in actions. And therefore it is quite difficult to transform this ethics, the system of ethics, into law or some kind of legal regulation, because you can always argue for one whose intention is good and who does research on embryos with a keen intention to level the harm of those infected by serious genetic diseases, that this intention may be good, even though he knows that he kills an embryo. From the Buddhist point of view, that is intentionalism, such as the Catholic Church. That is the beginning of human life is the building of the zygote. And therefore, it is really difficult to focus on Buddhist ethics. It creates certain barriers for developing a systematic position in regard to human embryonic stem cell research. Well, I will skip over the traditional accounts how a human life begins, and will show some positions which have been voiced how to modernize Buddhist ethics in that respect. There are 4 positions. First, the training of abstention of killing of lay ethics should be as much as possible in consent with the strict Vinaya rule, therefore killing of embryos would not be permissible. The second position, lay Buddhists have to work out compromises. Therefore it is legitimate if the intention guiding the action is not to kill, but to accept the death of the embryo as a necessary side condition of advancing possible medical treatment. The third position would be the description of conception and embryological development allows for a certain range of interpretation. Speaking of a substratum in which the consciousness principle may descend, therefore the initial moment of the appearance of consciousness is not sexual intercourse, but a later moment. That would be some kind of modernization of the early texts. The fourth position, the Vinaya, let's say the training rules for monks and nuns, must be abandoned in the field of bioethics. The conception of conception and embryogenesis to be found therein is no longer valid, since female and male fertility substances are considered as essential for the emergence of a new being, and let's say embryo research would not be describable in these terms. I could offer examples for these positions, but I will not do so, but conclude with general remarks. I think one may see there's a broad spectrum of ethical evaluation within Buddhist traditions, and therefore it is difficult to ascertain a specific influence, although there is, of course, an influence, because all those scientists, let's say in countries such as Thailand, with more than 85% of Buddhists, or Taiwan, as personal individuals, they have a personal stance, which is also informed by their religious traditions. But in regard to the body of research ethics, which is institutionalized, this influence is very difficult to ascertain. There were several strategies of justification. For the example of Wu Su Kwang would be a wonderful example, which I cannot tap upon here. But I think all religious traditions conform in one respect, that they more or less react to research results and are not on the side to enforce research in a certain direction. Maybe certain Jewish scholars in Israel form an exemption, but even there I wouldn't say so. Thank you very much for your attention.